Very much, Rick, and also my thanks to all of you for being able to learn from all of you. And it's actually, with all I've learned and everything that I've been able to benefit from, I feel almost as though I should cut my remarks very short, because I've learned so much more than I have to give. And my special thanks to Dr. Kirk for allowing me and the Muslim community to be part of this conversation. Last month, a federal judge sentenced Amador Cortez Meza to 40 years for sex trafficking of minors, conspiracy, and smuggling charges for bringing young, impoverished Mexican women to Georgia. He was using ordinary houses in an ordinary Atlanta neighborhood as both a brothel and a prison for these young women. Some of you may have seen this news report on NBC last week in their nightly news program. In February of this year, twin brothers in Dalton, Illinois, pleaded guilty and were sentenced to 4 years in prison. They were charged with human trafficking for forced labor services and involuntary sexual servitude with a minor. The twins, who were 18 years of age, were trafficking teenage girls in various suburban hotels. And this is in the south suburbs of Chicago. This shows that the courts are prosecuting these cases, but they are becoming more difficult because of our mobile and online society. They are looking for a serial killer in New York. In fact, it was mentioned by one of the other presenters. They're looking for a serial killer in the New York City area suspected of killing women. Some of the women are supposedly or allegedly prostitutes in that area, and using Craigslist to meet them. In fact, there was a long story article in the New York Times Sunday edition where it talked about the sophistication of this particular suspect, in the sense that where he's made some of the cell phone calls in the areas of New York City that were highly populated, and it indicates a certain sophistication of not only police techniques, but also the use of technology. Also, the typical way these cases come to court is a problem. Normally, and we're very thankful for the officer in Maryland who spoke before us with respect to his work and vigilance in terms of tracking down these perpetrators who are trying to make victims of these young girls. But it's important for you to understand how these cases normally come to the court. Typically what happens in prostitution cases, the case comes to court because of the police officer's work, typically as an undercover officer. In other words, they're police women that pose as prostitutes undercover on the street, and that's how they typically catch the men who are guilty of attempted patronizing a prostitute or patronizing a prostitute. But when ordinary houses are used in ordinary neighborhoods or in suburban hotels or motels, this whole process becomes much more difficult. And also when foreigners are smuggled into the country who do not speak the language and do not know our culture, it is quite difficult to find and prosecute the leaders of these sex rings. With the current mood regarding undocumented persons, it is sometimes easier just to deport the women than to find an interpreter and investigate how and why these women came to be in America. Secondly, there may be a tremendous trust factor because of the culture where many of these women come from. The police many times are in partnership with the criminals. For that reason, I applaud the efforts of Linda Smith, president and founder of Shared Hope International. Her organization and the International Justice Mission are largely responsible for the 2009 Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking Report, which is leading the way to eradicate sexual slavery, along with many of the efforts that we've heard about here today and that we'll hear about also the rest of today and tomorrow. I urge everyone to support her organization and the reintroduced Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking Deterrence and Victim Support Act of 2010. It was actually introduced in 2010, and it was hoped that it would pass, but it's recently been reintroduced, and so we're hoping for support for that legislation. So please call your congressperson and let them know that you support this legislation. I know that that's a long title, but I will be around so that I can give you the specifics of that for your information. And at this point, let me point out that the materials that have been made available for this conference are excellent. And for that reason, I've had to modify some of my remarks because so much of the material that I was going to present, some of the statistics, were presented in a much more, how would you say, academic fashion than I would have presented them as a judge. And so out of respect for those presentations, I don't want to bore you with the same statistics that have already been very adequately presented. And also, in fact, the article that I was going to reference on the issue of sexting, which was in the New York Times, and I have it, a girl's nude photo and altered lives. It was also referenced in the material that Rick had assembled. So I thought it would be, I have the article here. Whoever wants it and gets it first, they can have it. But I thought it would be a little bit more meaningful based upon everything that I've heard here today and a little bit more honest to share some observations as a judge rather than give you a lot of details about the trappings of being a judge. I think it might be more helpful and more meaningful just to speak as a human being that has worn a black robe for 15 years and the things that I've observed in the context of what we've been talking about here today. So at this point, I'll cut off my presentation and just kind of speak to you if I could. I've run for judge 3 times. The first time I ran for judge was in the year 2000, and I was a civil court judge at the time and thought I was perfectly suited for civil court. Most of my experience as a lawyer had been as a civil practitioner. I was in a civil court already. I knew a lot of the lawyers. They knew me. I enjoyed the court, the physical space that I was in. And everyone said that based upon how I'd worked myself up through the system and the way I was regarded by the lawyers, that I was going to win. And I lost by 600 votes. So I had to consider what to do next. And as a result of that loss, and I feel very comfortable sharing this information with you because many times we have a plan, but, thank God, God knows where we might do better. And so as a result of that, for 2 years, I worked on major felony drug cases. I sent a lot of people, a lot of young men to prison. And in that process, you do your job, you take an oath, and so you do your job. But in that process, it was impossible as a human being not to recognize the waste of human potential that I was seeing week in and week out. So I ran again in 2 years, and when that time I did get elected, And so one of the things that I took on as a task was to be the judge of our drug court. And I think most of you are probably familiar with drug courts. There's a basic storyline with respect to criminal cases, and that is acquittal or conviction. Acquittal, the defendant goes home. If he's found guilty, he goes to prison, or there's a sentence. Drug court is different. It's a therapeutic model, and some of the materials that we have even talk about therapeutic justice. And the reason I mention that is that for me it was an opportunity to recognize the humanity that I saw in front of me, and an opportunity to say, yes, I see the waste, and I'm going to try and do something about it. I was also fortunate a few years later to start a reentry court in our county, working with ex-offenders. Again, there's a typical model that's been in existence for hundreds of years, especially in America. And that is people go to prison, they come back and they're on probation or on parole. The idea of a reentry court is that the court works with the person to try and help them get reconnected with the world. Many of the men have been away, and some women, but primarily men. Men have been away for 10, 15 years, and they've been institutionalized. So to come back into a community and not know what a microwave does, not know how to turn on a computer, let alone how to use it. But anyway, that was something that I was able to work on. But even in that process, I came to recognize that when people come to adult court, it's too late. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning all this, and I imagine your question is, well, what does that have about the convergence? I don't know how many of you saw the movie The Blind Side. Yeah. Well, the reason why I mention that is that I've recognized that if we really want to make a difference with respect to the product that we're seeing in society, we have to take an interest personally to make a difference. And so I'm stepping out of my comfort zone and taking a chance because I have the good sense to recognize that this is just not an ordinary, typical organization of people that I'm speaking to. Because they're ministers, they're pastors, they're leaders, and if not yourself, there is probably someone in your congregations that could benefit from what I'm about to say. One of the things I started doing several years ago is being a liaison with our charter high school, so that some of the kids that have an interest in law come to court, they get a chance to see how the courts work, and it allows me to be kind of a mentor to those young kids. And so I'm saying that when we think about the society that we live in, yes, there's a big conversation going on about education reform. But none of you are naive. And if we wait for the government to come in riding on the horse like the cavalry did in the old Cowboys movies, it's not going to happen. And if we want to see a difference with respect to our schools, we're going to have to find the time, either ourselves or encourage and inspire others to take on that task. When those 18-year-old twins in Dalton decided that they were going to start prostituting their female classmates, where were the adults in their lives? For those teenage girls that felt that they had no option, that that's the only thing that they could do, where were the adults, the parents in their lives? One of the things that I've seen as a judge, unfortunately, is that many times what the court is trying to do is protect young people from their families. And by volunteering at a school, be it tutoring, just making yourselves available to talk to kids, be a mentor, you're an extra person that may become the only friend that that young person has. What has allowed the drug court to work, the reentry court to work for me in the county where I work, is for many of the young men and women that I saw, I was the first friend that they had ever met. The first person that ever believed they could hold down a job. The first person that ever believed that they could get off drugs. The first person that ever talked to them instead of being a victim as to somebody who wanted to help them. So the reason I meant to mention the blind side is it's a metaphor for what can happen when one person, and we've heard this mentioned before today, that when one person decides to make a difference in another person's life. And young people are very smart, very intuitive, and they know when somebody is there out of genuine care, love, and attention. And so if we want to see our church family as not just the ones who come to our facilities on Sundays or Fridays or Saturdays, but that they may be someone sitting in a class with no one to talk to who are basically on their own. We may be the person, or someone in our congregation may be the person that can make a difference in that young person's life. So when they get the invitation to send a message over their cell phone, they may come to you and say, what do you think about that? Or when somebody invites them to do something that is going to be destructive and disrespectful of other females, they may ask you, what are your thoughts about that? But we know that if the only circle of friends that they have to respond to is the internet and their peers, we know what decision they're going to make. So I ask you, as you leave here and look at options in terms of how we can process and make sense of everything that we've heard over these last 2 days, please consider the young people that are in your neighborhood going to school, and many of them, trust me, are on their own. And it's the friend that can come from this meeting that may make a difference in those people's lives, those young people's lives. So thank you so much for, again, allowing me, Dr. Kirk, to be part of this. And we look forward to other good things that can come from it.